Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. If you're interested in learning about the ketogenic diet like I was, to save my own life, then this is probably the podcast for you. 8 years ago, I knew nothing about it. 6 years ago, it saved my life. 3 years ago, I started researching and talking with some of the authorities in the field and attending medical conferences about this to understand why and how keto so dramatically changed my and my wife's Judy's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to share our journey of discoveries with you in understanding how keto is so effective in improving so many different conditions, from obesity, epilepsy, diabetes, infertility, MS, Alzheimer's, heart disease, to name a few. So take a step away from all the hype you've probably heard and roll up your sleeves with me and join me weekly to explore this living miracle that anyone can access. We'll talk science, we'll talk food. We'll explore its history and evolution to today, which is that the sheer wonder of the ketogenic way of eating has changed untold number of lives, unlike anything before it. And in case I forget to mention it, please join our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome back to another episode of the Keto Naturopath. Today, I kind of want to do a bit of a review, a little bit of a toned-down rant about some of the issues that we deal with in terms of our food supply. But what I want to sort of capitalize on is what has happened to my thinking. In other words, how has my thinking evolved in the last 2.5 years of doing this podcast? It's called Keto Naturopath, of course. And we have a blog called Keto Naturopath, recipes and so on and so forth, and a Facebook group called Keto Naturopath. And yet, as you've listened to this particular podcast, that we've gone down the road of a lot of interviews, a lot of research of over the last 100 years, back when William Wilder started in 1921, of the idea of the ketogenic diet, the therapeutic ketogenic diet for epilepsy, and the different forms it's taken after that. So we've talked about the explorers in the Arctic. We've talked about research in the 50s and 60s about MCT oil. We've talked about research in Texas in the 60s and early 70s about glucagon and insulin, and glucagon being actually the more important hormone over insulin relative to diabetes. And that was Dr. Roger Unger. Anyway, this layering of understanding is about evolving. It's not getting one more little piece of information to see, I gotcha. See, you got to do this. You got to do this, or you're a stupid person. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, and I've tried to outline, this is my journey that I'm sharing with you. I'm not telling you to change your lives at all. I'm going to encourage you to change your lives, for sure. I would think that would be a really prudent thing to do. But I'm also sort of a ship in the sea like we all are. And I'm pointing out some common obstacles that we all can steer ourselves around, if you want to go with that analogy. So what I wanted to end up with in terms of this podcast was that I believe we are now at a place, myself, my wife, and the experience we've had in coaching a number of people, and with all the labs we take, which has evolved as well, is that I think we're at the place of pretty much the safest, most effective way to lose weight in this modern era in the industrialized nations. And I'll go into why I think that. But the point I'm trying to hold on to here, it's been an evolution. I wasn't coming into this to prove something. I came into this because I missed something. How did I miss the ketogenic diet when I had Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and was about to have my lower bowel removed, at least in pieces, if not entirely, and live for the rest of my life in a colostomy bag? How did I avoid that? Well, I avoided that. I believe most of it was about the ketogenic diet, but it's bigger than that. So that's where I started. That was my entrance onto the highway of learning about these things. So I did go to the conferences back, and it was in 1914, right? 2014, 2015, 16, 17, every year, early metabolic therapy conferences, met with the movers and shakers and the whole exogenous ketones and what they do or don't do. And right now, you and I, live in a world that is primarily controlled by marketing. It's not controlled by appropriate, articulate, specific, well-backed research that you know what to do. Here's a quote that came up to me this week by Jon Stewart, if you remember him from The Daily Show. And his quote was pretty simple. The enemy is noise. The goal is clarity. So the enemy is noise. So the noise around the ketogenic diet, the noise around protein diets or carnivore, or it's this noise, it's imprecise. It's sort of like a rumor that this is helpful, and it's most likely helpful for some, but it's also backed with a lot of gunpowder of marketing. Keto has become a worthless term in my mind. If people say, oh, keto, even naturopaths, I won't say I coach naturopaths, but they call to review findings with me, and it's like, they don't have a clue. Oh yeah, I just dropped the carbs and it's all about the ketones. I don't think it's all about the ketones. I think that ketones are very, very healthy. They're an inflammation preventative as opposed to being an anti-inflammatory component. They're great for, so now we're speaking of ketones. They're great for, TBI, total brain injury, obviously Alzheimer's. We've been through all these things. So you know what they're used for. And yes, it would be great if we had a diet that we comfortably were producing a lot of ketones. Well, now having umpteen people through our program and our program evolving, I can tell you some people, it just like it was right out of practice, people are motivated by the degree that they are in pain. So if they are in pain, they're going to really listen to me and they're going to really get some some benefits. And so if there's others that are going, I heard about this, gosh, kind of an expensive program. If they're just not into it from the beginning and they're going to watch my program like a Netflix program, they'll show up for their meetings. They'll have these labs are interesting. But if it's all water off a duck's back, I've learned not to have these people in the program anymore, by the way. It's pointless. They got to be motivated to make a change. If you're not in pain, it's highly, 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 highly unlikely you will take action to improve the health of your life. You're just not going to come on intellectual information by, gosh, I should do this. You're going to come because either you have joint pain, you have heart issues, you've been told by your doctor you are obese or that you need to look at dropping your weight. It's something's going to happen to you mentally. Maybe it's your sense of mortality. Big word there, huh? I know we all know what it means. I don't mean that you didn't know what that means. I mean that it's muffles the impact of, are you aware of the end of your life and how do you want to go out? Do you want to live in another 40 years healthy, or do you want to be, Uncle Bob who likes to stroke his stomach in public and gets a thrill when his nephews and nieces pull his finger, for those of another generation. I think if we aspire to have better quality lives, we will do a lot of changing. However, the enemy is noise. The enemy is noise. The noise is marketing. The noise is partial truths that have been slathered over with many, many layers of unsupportable claims. And so that's just the way it is. But the goal is clarity. So I'm on the goal side, I hope. I hope you get that from me now, 2.5 years into it. And so the clarity is, what do we do? We have this, why did this obesity epidemic happen? And it's not just obesity. It's about blood sugar dysregulation. So they call that dysglycemia. It's not always being high. Sometimes it's always being low. But basically, it's the sawtooth up and down and up and down and up and down that leads to a lot of things. I think one of the things that I've been working on, a number of, patients, clients that have a history of AFib. Obviously, they have to work with their docs. But when you have a history of atrial fibrillation, you eventually are on the conveyor belt to get a nerve block or get what they call an ablation therapy. They go up through your femoral artery and they in essence, cauterize a nerve in a part of your heart, the one that's been sort of firing out of rhythm, which has given you this problem. So that's how they get rid of it. Is that a sure thing? No. Did they, first of all, what's going to keep you from developing another one and another nerve? And so that's usually what happens. Then you go in for another ablation. So gradually they start killing your heart from the inside out before you have a heart attack. So that's really odd. And so why am I going down this road for a second? It's about carbs. It's about that seesaw graph of being high in carbs and then being low in carbs, high in carbs, and you may not have the qualifying data via hemoglobin 1AC or via the 3 random glucose levels of 126 or higher, but you have pretty close to that. And this is hard on your heart. And in fact, it's interesting to note that endurance athletes, first of all, they have high mortality. So you have marathoners, you look into marathoners, they have a much higher cancer rate than others. They've run themselves into deficient immune systems. More complicated than that, but basically that covers it. And they have a higher incidence of AFib. And so there's a thing called Heart Math. It's out of Boston, which measures your heart rate variability. That is the degree that your heart rate has a specific rhythm and the strength of that rhythm. So if it's all over the place, so that variability would be very high. If you have a low variability, that's generally pretty good. It means your heart anticipates it's strong enough, it can reproduce what it just did before to pump your blood. Okay. Well, the problem is with these athletes is that and when you think about their heart has worked out a lot, right? For all the training they had to do for marathons or ultra distances. It could be long distance swimming, by the way. Think of these ultra cardiovascular events. And by the way, the first person who ever ran the marathon, that was told to go warn the troops back with, how many years of BC? Was it 500 years plus BC? He died. He made it and delivered the message, but he died. So long-term cardiovascular exercise is not a good thing. Another tangent for another podcast, and I've partially covered that before. But what I'm saying is that your heart doesn't get stronger, doesn't get better by doing hours and hours and hours of cardiovascular exercise. In addition to that, your heart does get weaker by not feeding it its preferred fuel, which is ketones. And so by not feeding its preferred fuel, what are you feeding it? You're feeding it glucose, obviously. That means you're basically eating carbs. And so all these ultra distances, all these endurance sports athletes believed for many generations that high carb diets were the way to go. So a combination of a high carb diet and the history of, you're going to make your heart work harder and longer, many more hours than anybody else, is going to damage your heart. That's how you get into AFib, by a self-induced behavior, thinking that cardiovascular exercise can be great and you're going to do carb loading because you need to have carbs, you need to have sugar to run. No, actually you don't. You need to eventually become a fat burner, which is a transition. It's not a moment in time. You start and you get better at being more and more efficient. Okay, then. So that means your fuel, and by the way, when your heart starts to fail, congestive heart failure, for example, starts to fail, not a heart attack, starts to fail, it's grasping for other fuels to use, and it has a strong appetite, if you will, that always did, for ketones. Ketones is what it wants. So just like the brain that you've starved from glucose by having consistently high glucose. We covered this on a number of other podcasts. This is sort of the root of dementia. It's the root of Alzheimer's, is that because you've had such sustained high glucose, your heart and your brain have had to downregulate its cellular channels to receive that glucose. So think about a heart, it's being yelled at. It's got so much glucose, it's being yelled at. Think of your nerve cells in your brain are being yelled at. So what happens is you tend to listen less, or you try to turn down the volume knob. So that's what it's done. It's turned down the volume knob on the glucose entering into the cell. Well, the problem is when you don't have that consistently high volume of glucose, it doesn't get enough glucose. So now it has neither ketones and it has neither glucose because you self-induced that behavior. Okay, then. So you have a starving heart, you have a starving brain. And what are you going to do about it? Well, there's really only one thing you can do about it. You're going to have to learn how to adopt the degree that you care. And this is the point that I'm starting. A lot of people don't care. Oh, I'm going to die. When your time's up, your time's up. It's like, what? They have no responsibility to take care of the body that they were given by their parents and ancestry, by God, wherever you want to go with that, So they're going to go, well, no, it's the way it is. It's destiny. I was designed to eat donuts for my life, and I'm just going to go out eating donuts, apparently. No, I just can't, say, yeah, yep, there's logic to that. Not in my world, not in my life. And so back to the brain, the starving brain and the starving heart, what do you give it? You give it ketones. So if you don't adapt, if you don't learn to know how comfortably, deliciously to be able to make food and eat food that makes ketones, as opposed to making glucose, you're just going to get worse and worse and worse. And I could add in a lot of other situations. The labs we've been doing opens the door to autoimmune. I do believe it's the genesis of autoimmune. It's the beginning of autoimmune, of having elevated glucose, whether it's the seesaw pattern, whether it's consistently high, whether consistently low. All three of those are going to get you into pretty much the same place. The seesaw pattern is exhausting. It's exhausting for your pancreas. It's exhausting for your liver. And it's exhausting for all of those trying to receive a constant message of a little glucose, please, not a lot. Mostly ketones. Glucose is always, part of the brain's always needed some glucose, but it's a lot less than you thought. And it's certainly not the entire brain at all. So that sets you up. So let me just jump to real life. This is a bit extemporaneous podcast, but not really. I do actually have an outline in front of me that I want to talk about. But so I have a sibling who is going to go in for heart ablation, and that's her choice. And I'm not one to say, no, don't do that. Don't do that. My 40 years in health industry has already gone by, and people either are interested will ask you, that when the student is ready, when the patient is ready, the doctor will appear. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. It's an old Japanese koan. And so we are all that person or that patient. And so if they're not ready, they're just not going to receive the information. And it's not that they cannot understand it because they don't understand the medical jargon or medical ease and they don't have the medical background. Baloney. I just don't buy it. And so what we did, in the very least, I said, hey, do me a favor and put on the CMG, continual glucose monitor, Freestyle Libre, and I'll do it at the same time. So we got on Zoom and I showed her how to put it on by putting mine on and she put hers on. And so because I'm a physician, I get to have people hook up to my particular account and I can just check in 24/7 to see how their blood sugar is doing by a pattern. It's not a perfect thing. It's not a perfect continual glucose monitor, and technically it's not because it's a fiber. It's not a blood measuring. It doesn't go into a capillary directly into the bloodstream. However, having said that, no, it's just by passive diffusion. You're sort of testing the tissues that are outside the bloodstream, and it's usually off. It takes, I would say, a day or so for it to get to know you. And that first day, it could be off as much as 40. It has been off at 40 for me. And then it gets down to being pretty close to, at least for me, never exact. It rides between 10 and 5 points off. But the pattern, that's what I tell people, it's the pattern that we're after. So when I compare patterns between my sister and me, her pattern's pretty jagged up. And I'll say, hey, so what was going on at 11 o'clock on Wednesday night? Oh, I had some naked orange juice and this, that, or the other thing. I was hungry. Well, so what'd she have? She had carbs. But when I tell her, oh, you have a high carb diet, I don't have a high carb diet. I have a healthy diet. Oh, really? What's the healthy part? I have bananas and avocados and I have nuts. And, you can only go so far with a question, with that kind of conversation of carbs versus good carbs versus bad carbs. So she thinks she's having good carbs. Then she has some veggies. She has some broccoli once in a while and maybe even some Brussels sprouts or salad. And I'm not being facetious there. We all grew up with massive gardens. Our mother conscripted us at an early age, and so it's in our brains to have gardens like that. I haven't had a garden the last couple of years, but the previous 30 I did. And we made and put away a lot of canning things. So it's really interesting. My diet now is actually primarily various kinds of meat or fish and so on and so forth. And since we've been recently doing protein-sparing modified fast, I've encouraged everybody to have food, but to have lean courses of meat, lean meat, fish. So fish is lean. Even a fatty fish is lean by meat standards. For 3 days a week, just to have that. And then your 4 days a week, you can go have your fatty stuff or do whatever. And you see how people quickly lose fat, but only after they've already been keto for a while. So people who come into protein sparing fast are going to go, this sucks. It hurts. Well, it's because it's a fast. This person's suddenly going to be dropping their carbs and never done that before and just come in and they go, this is stupid. And for them, it is stupid. It's kind of I look at it as an advanced therapy that is great, and it is the answer for me. And what I've seen in others is after keto, right? What is keto? Keto is a measured amount of 20 grams or less of carbs per day, and arguably high fat, so they are fat burners. But now we've gone through that phase by a couple months, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, whatever it takes for you to get there. On the other side, take away the fats. Not completely, just take foods that still have fat in them, but you're taking out the fat. And it's remarkable. It's remarkable what we see. We're going to start doing labs. So far, we've just done CGMs and so on, and ketones and blood glucose. And so we can do the glucose ketone index and see how that changes. But it would be great to do some of these panels. Labs are expensive because people work with me. It's all out of pocket. So anyway, that's a roundabout way of saying, the noise. The noise is the enemy is the noise. The goal is clarity. I'm trying to provide clarity initially for myself and sharing what I've discovered. What I've discovered, what works, what's been lab verified. When I listen to other doctors, at these conferences and so on, and they sort of espouse their knowledge, and I appreciate that. I appreciate them more before than I do now. And now I see them as being stuck. They didn't want to evolve. They want a following, and they say, this is what I do. Come to my practice. And it's like, they're trying to be you don't need to track things. I said, yeah, track things. Up front, let's get together and track. You're not going to do it for the rest of your life, but let's just get together and track. You need to know the variables in your life. That makes sense to me. Not like willy-nilly. How many people come to me and say, it's rhetorical, and say, I've been doing keto for a while and it just doesn't work for me. And I go, okay, great. How much carbs do you have? They have no idea. I'm not quite sure if they know what carbs are, but they drop the carbs. Okay, well, how much fat did you? I don't know. I had more fat. What were your sources of fat? Well, mostly they're probably seed oils, vegetable oil, for salad dressings, cooking, and so on and so forth. So it's terrible. So, they need basic education. Let's start tracking. Let's start cleaning up some of the obvious low-hanging fruit areas of improvement in this person's life, and you'll see dramatic changes. Pretty straightforward, dramatic changes. And so as they get to understand, it can complain and bellyache about the tracking of the food that they're eating, there's part of them that gets to like the fact that they finally know what they're doing. They finally know what they're doing. They finally have a pretty good idea of how many carbs they're having per day, depending on the app and so on. And then we wean them off it. So they learn these things like you teach a child that goes to school. You teach a pet. Who else do we teach? Teach ourselves. You need to learn some basic skills so you never have to go back to learning them again because they become you. So, I just find that's absolutely necessary. I find a conversation without some sort of empirical data inane. It's totally baseless. It's stupid. And somebody's trying to impress somebody. Anyways, back to these people that ask me, and in our Facebook group, it usually comes up. Okay, well, tell me, give me an idea of what you have. Crickets. They don't want to get back to me. They have no idea. They're asking for the next little thing. Oh, give me the pill, the vitamin, because you're a naturopathic guy, they think. And you can give me the vitamin that's going to create immediate fat loss usually. And give me some of that mental clarity. Throw in one of those pills too. So that pill mentality hasn't changed much. It's not about allopathic versus naturopathic. People go, yeah, I want safe versus unsafe. Well, that's kind of a general truism, I guess. But how about about eating healthily for one, and this is what it is. All right. So where do we get back to? My diet has changed significantly. I compare my graphs now with my sister. I will be doing that actually. And it's a dramatic difference. And so when I send her little, screenshots of mine and what I've done or so on, so I can't make mine flat like yours. How does she know? I have not talked about drop carbs or anything else. I just said, hey, just slap this on your arm. I'm curious to have another person who's about to go in for that has AFib, is going in for an ablation sometime in the next month, what that looked like. And then maybe afterwards, in the very least, I'll see what it looks like again. But if you're always going to be relying on carbs as your sense of, I got to have something to eat. I got to have something to eat. I'm a special person. I got a problem. I need to have something to eat. Well, you're not a special person. The problem is universal. And the problem is because you're eating mostly carbs, and I would say probably mostly processed foods, but nobody wants to admit that, really. Nobody wants to admit that they're a processed food addict. So anyways, we built a program around, yes, initially it is upfront tracking data. We'll call that keto. And then we transition to a kind of, I won't say just the opposite. It's protein focused with some fats in the whole food sources of protein. That's sort of the big obvious. They're doctored up. We do a lot of labs up front, so we really know what these people are doing. And so we can change a number of things, So you look at, you obviously look at your thyroid, look at carnitine, you look at your omega-3s, et cetera, et cetera. I've disclosed all these before. It's not a secret. It's a long list I don't want to get into now. But so we really know who we're dealing with as we move forward. These are not just willy-nilly, hey, you do this and you do that, and then you are good. That is the general truth, but people need to be supported, coddled, helped, and held accountable too. Support and accountability are the two things that are probably the dynamic thing that come with coaching to help people kind of get back on the highway of easy driving. The easy driving is the keto is easy driving. You taught them how to drive. You said, yep, we're doing low carbs, doing high fat initially, and we tell them how much protein they need to have. And then we're going to drop the fats and we're going to drop the carbs. We're going to be carbless. And then we're going to go to primarily protein. And they're going to feel wonderful. They're going to feel it's a little scarier because this is not what their mother told them, what their parents did. Eat everything on your plate, especially those veggies. It's like now Carl's kind of a crazy guy other than those labs, which are really fascinating. So that's where we move. And it's been tremendously successful. The labs have provided us to be a little more hand in glove on a per person basis. But the other variable is, and this is the part that a lot of people miss, is you really do have to approach this program as if you are working with people getting off an addictive substance, because you're dealing with, obviously I'm in the US, I'm dealing with the US American population, and they have been processed food eaters for their entire generation. I'm 63. So my age or younger and some older, they've had processed food since World War II. And more abundantly in the last couple decades for sure. That's pretty obvious, right? And so given that, they have been on a designed item of minimal nutrition, maximum calories, but highly addictive. It wasn't coincidental. It was planned. More things were added. Carbs in themselves are addictive, regardless of saying, oh, are you saying my salads are as addictive as my donut? No, the donut is more addictive than your salads, but both are. One's obviously better for you. And so it's the stuff in the flour and so on and so forth that's used to make your donut. And or whatever else you had, and the Captain Crunch, and the potato chips, and the all these other things that you have. And I would say that, looking back, it's been a long road. We've been doing this for 7 years. There was a point in which I thought chicharrones, those are the pork rinds, that, wow, they're great. They're like potato chips, fat potato chips. I've become a lot less. I haven't had chicharrones now for a couple months. And, it's just, we made our mayo and taught other people to make the mayo. And that's clearly part of the group too, to have a healthy source of mayonnaise. They can put on their food in that first part. And then I say, yeah, don't do that anymore. They take C8 because it's a quick ketone creator. That is, goes to the liver, and ketones are created, within 15 minutes. It's measurable, so it's not a new thing anymore. But I said, yeah, we're not going to do that for a while either. So we became fat burners. Then we took away the fat because that left us with burning our own fat. And we did it in a way of saying, hey, we're going to focus on proteins with that, a little fat with that. And off they go. But if we didn't look at the addictive component or the addiction component of food, we'd be a fool. You can't just say, bad person, you had another donut this week. Bad person. That's being ignorant. Absolutely being ignorant and hurtful. So you see that, but at the same time, you have to have a degree of accountability. There's sympathy, or there's empathy, really. Empathy, not sympathy. And you have to have the accountability. You have to acknowledge, so you have a reality you can share, and then you have to help them away from that. So speaking of empathy, one of the things that being addictive, being an addict, pick your substance, cocaine, heroin, the derivatives of heroin, meth, alcohol, even coffee to an extent. I mean, you can fill in that category as well as I can. But when you truly are dealing with an addict, I was about to say addictive personality, that you will see they really do not have the ability to have what they call cognitive empathy. They can't put themselves in another person's shoes to see the world through their eyes. They just can't do that. They live in a world that progressively becomes black and white. These are how things are, and I don't have time to consider other people's perspectives. I got to get my stuff done. So actually, right down to how we know about addiction through Sarah Volkoff and her brain scans of, where the blood glucose is taken up and all that, we know that obesity, the basis of obesity is carb addiction, and 99% of that is probably, and I don't have data in front of me to say this with great certainty, is processed food addiction. So with that kind of addiction, there's a separation of what they call the prefrontal cortex. So put your hand to your forehead. You want to get very specific. It's put your finger between your eyebrows, assuming you don't have a continuous eyebrow. And that's the area of reflection. That's the area of reconsideration. That's the area of cognitive empathy. And if that's not working for you, so an addict shows via Dr. Volkoff's work and others now that the prefrontal cortex doesn't get lit up with glucose. It doesn't come alive. It just doesn't get activated. So they don't think that way. So their thinking pattern has changed. It's about go get what you need. Go get what you need. And if somebody's in the way. So how does that flesh out in terms of just social infrastructure? Well, lack of cognitive empathy is like you don't really care about your neighbor, regardless of how close you live to them. And you're not going to talk to them. You're not going to be interested in talking to them. You have your own needs to contend with first. Okay, then. But that means, you can look at our political situation. People just argue. If you say anything speculative, it's like you're an idiot. I dare you to post something on Facebook in a Trump or a Biden Facebook group that might ask a question that would be a fair question. You will get your Facebook fingers bitten off, so to say. So, but that's just an example of, that's not a place, there's no discussion going on. There's no, let's do some talking. Unfortunately, religion's that way too. you're this religion or that religion. And of course, it's not for everybody, but it's become more divisive between us. There's not like, that guy had a point. I think I'll consider that. I might not come around to his or her point, but let me consider his point for a while. See, that's the ability that lacks with this kind of social infrastructure. But the food, that's the point. The food, the processed food, the high carb diet, the standard American diet is high carbs, propitiates that. It makes it more and more likely that people are just not going to connect with their prefrontal cortex. They're not going to reflect on anything you said to them or I said to them. And so we go our separate ways. So that has changed. So if you go back, let's say 150 years ago, it's not that people didn't have arguments then or before where you really, in the very least, you're pre-processed foods, right? And you can even go pre-canned foods where you had to have your veggies. So those are but it was mostly the fish. If you go back, I think of Norway, where I lived for a while, is that, old Norway, Scandinavia, it was that they had the cod on these clotheslines, right? They had the cod that was salted and they hung out there. And so they were permanently, dried. And so it was all about protein first. That's where our sustenance was. It wasn't the garden they had in the back. And we got into that a little bit when we talked about epigenetics before and the villages in Sweden and such. And so what I'm saying is the carbs are a big deal. And yes, it's easy to sort of have the metabolic transition. You got your labs and these are things you need to do. And there's a variation on a theme, meaning some people need more changes in some of their labs. Might mean various supplements. It might mean more support and accountability in a certain direction than somebody else would need. But eventually you got to get off the carbs. You got to wean yourself from that addictive substance, processed foods, and then the healthier carbs. People can have salads for the rest of their lives, but if you were actually off of processed foods, it is not in your life anymore, then you are miles ahead. You're continents ahead of anybody else. The degree that you want to consider going carbless, that's just up to you, but you've already done the lion's share of the work. And by having that, you will have health improvement on many levels. So I just want to agree with the quote from Jon Stewart by saying that the enemy is the noise. It's the noise. It's the false information you've been given about the various dietary ways of eating, various diet names, things you should be taking, a supplement's going to change your life. All that is a lie based on commercial interest, period. I'm trying to share with you why I haven't been on medications for the last 7 years and why I've done what was, I was strongly advised not to do, which was to go off medications and get healthy. Get healthy, I added that in. So I hope that helps. And until next time, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp. I just wanted to encourage you to send in your questions to drgoldkamp@ketonaturopath.com. Many of you have, and so what I've done with these questions that gotten back to most of the people I email, but some of the questions that were so good, and if they were overlapping to other questions, I would combine them and try to put that into the topic of a podcast, either via one of the micro topics that are covered in an interview. As you know, we cover a lot of topics in any given interview, or some of my own sort of reporting, if you will, on some of these issues. So please keep the questions coming. Feel free to send in an email, and I will get back to you. One thing I want to say, a number of questions have come in which I've given this answer and the email didn't work. So just make sure that you're receiving at the same email that you sent it in. And I think that might have been the difficulty. So I look forward to your questions. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I'm open to answer your questions. And I think this world of keto is not just black and white. It's nice that it's simple, but it's not simple for some. I'm really trying to, go down as any of you who have listened to all my podcasts. We started way back when, history and evolution and epilepsy and so on and so forth. Now we're seeing some tremendous overlap in various mental disorders, such as schizophrenia or neurological disorders that are not just epilepsy. And also, just for people in losing weight, it's sometimes pretty complicated for them to engage in keto. And so they need some help. And so that's the whole point of, at least that's what I think I'm doing, is exploring the world of why are there other factors. And so in exploring some of those other factors, we've covered addiction, we've covered hormones, we've covered nutritional deficiencies, we've covered certain metabolic lab results, and we'll go further. We'll even get to more on genome and aspects. So these are all just contributions that make for an obstacle for some people to engage easily in the ketogenic diet. This is my belief, and these are the things that I've discovered. And I think other people have discovered some of these things, but not ever put them together. So stay listening, send in your questions, and I will definitely get back to you.